Welcome to Validation Controls. Don't forget Page.IsValid, brought to you by Jardine software. In this quick demonstration, I'm going to show you what the Page.IsValid property is used for and how easy it is to bypass the client validation provided by our validation controls so that we really need to make sure that we're checking that is valid and what happens when we don't check that property when we're relying on validation controls to do our work. So here we have a quick example of a registration form where I've already pre-filled in the first name, last name, email address, confirmation email address, password. That's left blank right now because that's actually required, and then confirm password. So if I just click register on this, we can see what type of controls I already have validation controls on, because we can see my email address isn't valid, my email confirmation is not valid, and my password field is actually required. Now that was all done client-side with JavaScript. It never actually sent it up to the server, and that's why the validation controls are so great, is because they provide both client and server-side functionality right off the bat. The problem with this is that if I go in and fill this properly, so if I put a valid email address in both of these, and I fill in a password, I don't really care what it is, I register, I get a nice message, hey, my data was saved, and that's the functionality we expect to see. I've made it past all my validation controls, so of course my page is going to save. The dilemma comes in, what happens when an attacker or a malicious user decides they're going to fill something in here, and they intercept the traffic? So I can't get past my JavaScript client-side stuff, but if I can intercept it with Fiddler, which is what I'm going to use, then I can then change that data. So I'm going to modify my email address so it's not valid. So let me go ahead and intercept the request. I'll submit valid data on the client side so I can bypass the JavaScript. I'm going to make the JavaScript happy. I've now intercepted my request, and now over here I'm going to come in and I'm going to look for that email address. And I found it right here. And let me just go ahead and make that not a valid email address. I'll stop my interception mode and I'll run to completion. And we can actually see that this same message box that I got when my data was saved popped up and said, hey, your data is saved. But look over here on the left. I actually see the error messages saying email is not valid, email addresses don't match. So what happened here was the validation controls did what they were supposed to. Client side, it was right. Server side, it was not right. So it actually said, oh, nope, these aren't right. It created the error messages for it, but we never checked the page.isValid. So when we submitted it, it actually ran our registration function, and we actually see this work. So if we look at the code behind here, this is the code block that we just ran where we're not checking the page.isValid. And as you can see, I'm just outputting a simple alert box so we could see the difference between the validation messages and when our data is saved. Now, if we want to actually do this properly, what we want to do is down here in this other click event where we actually check and say, if the page is valid, go ahead and save our data. Right? This is just a message so we can see it, but normally we would actually have functionality here. Otherwise, if the page isn't valid, then we're going to kick it back out to the user. Normally we may not even have this else block and just let the validation summary handle it. So this is a lot better because it's actually going to go and look at that property. So what really happens is when the page comes up, it loops through all those validated controls and it looks and says, okay, are you valid? Are you valid? Are you valid? And if it finds any that aren't valid, all it does is it puts this message up into this list to be able to display to the user, hey, these controls aren't valid. And it marks the is valid equals false. But it doesn't actually stop the execution of the page. It's just going to let us know so we can then check the Boolean, but nothing checks that automatically for us. So we actually need to add this check in here to check that. So if we go back to our page, we can actually have our register protected over here. So this is that other function we just looked at, which checks the is valid. So now, if I put in valid information, so I bypass my client-side JavaScript, I'm going to capture my request again. I'm going to register protected this time. We've stopped it. Let me find the email address hiding out in here. I'll put an invalid email address, so that will blow up on us. We'll stop recording, and then we will run to completion. Now, as you can see this time, we did the same exact steps, except for this time it actually didn't save our data. It just returned back to us, email's not valid, email address doesn't match, because as we can see, we modified the data here and it is no longer valid. So you can see how easy it is to bypass that client-side validation control, and then if the developers aren't actually checking that is valid, and this goes the same way for your model.isValid if you're using MVC. This is the same exact thing, that if you're not checking that, if I can bypass your client side, even though on the server side it's going to say this isn't valid, it may still actually run the code. So make sure that when you're using the validation controls, even though you may not have to call other properties on those validation controls, like you may not have to call Page.IsValid, because most of the controls will validate automatically when we do a button.submit. However, we still do need to make sure that we check this property for Page.IsValid. Otherwise, we may miss this, and it may be possible for somebody to actually submit incorrect data, even though we had the good intention of doing strong input validation. So that's a real quick walkthrough of why we need Page.IsValid and making sure that everybody is using that if they're using the validation controls that are built in with the .NET framework. So I hope you enjoyed this, and thanks for watching.